I grew up in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by the beauty of the Pacific Northwest. Hiking and camping were practically in my blood. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip to Olympic National Park in Washington. We'd heard so many great things about the park, and were eager to explore its lush forests and rugged coastline. Little did we know, it would turn out to be a trip we'd never forget for all the wrong reasons. We planned our trip for late summer, hoping to avoid the crowds. Our group consisted of 4 of us: me, Jake, my girlfriend Lisa, my buddy Tom, and his girlfriend Sarah. We all took a Friday off work and headed out early in the morning, aiming to get to the park by mid-afternoon. The drive was scenic, filled with the kind of picturesque views you only find in the Pacific Northwest. As we crossed the Hood Canal Bridge, the excitement in the car was palpable. We were ready for an adventure. We arrived at Olympic National Park around 3 p.m. and quickly found our campsite at the Hoh Rainforest area. The site was perfect, nestled among towering trees and thick ferns. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for a weekend of relaxation and exploration. The first night was uneventful. We roasted marshmallows, told stories around the campfire, and marveled at the clear, starry sky. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. The next day, we decided to hike the Hoh River Trail. The trail was breathtaking, with ancient trees draped in moss and the constant sound of the river in the background. We hiked for hours, stopping occasionally to take photos and soak in the scenery. By the time we returned to our campsite, it was late afternoon, and we were all exhausted. We decided to take a quick dip in the river to cool off before starting dinner. As we were splashing around, Tom noticed something shiny near the edge of the water. He waded over and pulled out a small, weathered metal box. It was old, covered in rust and dirt, and looked like it had been there for years. We gathered around as he opened it, revealing a collection of yellowed papers, a few coins, and a rusty pocket knife. Most of the papers were illegible, but one seemed to be a map. It was crudely drawn and didn't match any of the trails in the park. We shrugged it off as someone's failed treasure hunt and decided to keep it as a souvenir. That night, as we sat around the fire, the forest seemed eerily quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and owls were absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. We joked about the map and the possibility of hidden treasure, but there was an underlying tension none of us could shake. We turned in early, hoping a good night's sleep would clear our minds. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside our tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon scavenging for food. But the rustling grew louder and more deliberate. I sat up, straining to hear over Lisa's soft snores. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow and methodical, moving around the perimeter of our campsite. My heart began to race. I reached over and gently shook Lisa awake. She groggily sat up, and I put a finger to my lips, signaling for her to be quiet. The footsteps continued, now circling closer to our tent. Lisa's eyes widened in fear, and I could feel her trembling beside me. I reached for the pocket knife we had found earlier and held it tightly. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. We held our breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the tent zipper began to move. I tensed, ready to defend us if necessary, but the zipper stopped halfway, and the footsteps retreated into the forest. We didn't sleep the rest of the night, lying awake in terror until the first light of dawn. When we finally emerged from the tent, we found Tom and Sarah already up, looking just as shaken as we were. They had heard the footsteps, too. We decided to pack up and move to a different campsite, hoping to put some distance between us and whatever had stalked us during the night. We drove to a different part of the park, settling on a more populated campsite near the Sol Duc Hot Springs. The presence of other campers was reassuring, and we quickly set up our tents again. We spent the day trying to shake off the previous night's events, hiking to the Soul Duck Falls and soaking in the hot springs. By evening, we were starting to feel more relaxed. As night fell, we made a fire and tried to regain some sense of normalcy. The other campers around us provided a comforting background noise, and we began to feel like maybe we had overreacted. We stayed up late, laughing and talking, finally starting to enjoy our trip again. Around midnight, the campsite grew quiet as people began turning in for the night. We decided to follow suit and crawled into our tents, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again, the same slow, deliberate footsteps from the night before. My blood ran cold as I listened. This time, the footsteps didn't circle the campsite. They came straight toward our tent. Lisa and I lay there, frozen in fear. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent, and we could hear heavy breathing. I gripped the pocket knife, my mind racing with possibilities. Then the footsteps moved away, heading toward Tom and Sarah's tent. I could hear them rustling around, followed by muffled voices. I wanted to call out, but fear kept me silent. Suddenly, there was a loud, blood-curdling scream. Lisa and I bolted upright, and I scrambled out of the tent, knife in hand. I rushed over to Tom and Sarah's tent, finding it unzipped and empty. My heart pounded as I called out their names, but there was no response. The other campers began to stir, emerging from their tents to see what was going on. A few of them helped me search the area, but Tom and Sarah were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. We spent the rest of the night searching, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but we found no trace of them. By morning, we were exhausted and terrified. We reported Tom and Sarah's disappearance to the park rangers, who organized a search party. We spent the next 2 days combing the forest, but there was no sign of them. The rangers found our story about the footsteps and the metal box hard to believe, but they took our report seriously. Eventually, the search was called off, and we were forced to leave the park without our friends. Back in Portland, Lisa and I tried to return to our normal lives, but the weight of what happened in Olympic National Park never left us. The police conducted their investigation, interviewing us multiple times, but they found no leads. Tom and Sarah's families were devastated, and we felt a crushing guilt for not being able to protect our friends. Nightmares plagued our sleep, and every creak or rustle in the night would send us into a panic. Months passed, and we tried to move on. Lisa and I started seeing a therapist to help cope with the trauma. Talking about it helped a bit, but there were still so many unanswered questions. The metal box we found remained in my possession, a grim reminder of that horrifying weekend. Sometimes I would take it out and examine the contents, hoping to find some clue we had missed, but it always felt like a dead end. One night I decided to do some research on the area around Olympic National Park. I scoured online forums and local news archives, looking for any stories that might explain what happened to Tom and Sarah. I found plenty of tales about mysterious disappearances and eerie occurrences in the park, but nothing that matched our experience. Just as I was about to give up, I stumbled across a post on a forgotten forum. The post was from a man named Dave, who claimed to have had a similar experience in the Hoh rainforest. He wrote about finding an old metal box with a map inside and being stalked by someone or something in the forest. His story was eerily similar to ours, right down to the footsteps outside the tent. I reached out to him, hoping he was still active on the forum. A few days later, I received a response. Dave was still haunted by his experience and was eager to talk. We arranged a call, and he recounted his story in detail. He and his girlfriend had found the box years ago, and shortly after, they started hearing footsteps at night. Like us, they had tried to move campsites, but the footsteps followed them. One night, his girlfriend had gone missing, just like Tom and Sarah. Dave had never found her and had been searching for answers ever since. We talked for hours, sharing every detail of our experiences. Dave mentioned that he had kept the map and had spent years trying to decipher it. He believed it marked the location of something significant, possibly the lair of whoever or whatever was stalking the park. He offered to send me a copy, and I eagerly accepted. When the map arrived, I laid it out on our dining table and compared it to the one we found. The markings were similar, but Dave's map had additional notes and symbols. He had made several trips back to the park, mapping out the area in painstaking detail. Lisa and I decided we needed to go back to Olympic National Park one last time, hoping to find closure and possibly some answers. We contacted the park rangers and informed them of our plans. They were reluctant but agreed to keep a close watch on us. Dave agreed to meet us there, and together we would follow the map. The drive to the park was tense, filled with a mix of dread and determination. We arrived at the Hoh Rainforest and met up with Dave, who looked just as haunted as we felt. We set out early the next morning, following the map through dense forest and along hidden trails. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The familiar sounds of nature were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. As we neared the spot marked on the map, a sense of foreboding washed over us. We arrived at a clearing, dominated by a large ancient tree. The map indicated that this was the spot. We searched the area, looking for any signs of what the map might be pointing to. Dave found an old, overgrown trail leading away from the clearing, and we decided to follow it. The trail was barely visible, and we had to push through thick underbrush to make any progress. After what felt like hours, we emerged into another clearing, this one smaller and more secluded. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, barely visible through the foliage. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The cabin was empty, save for some broken furniture and a few scattered papers. We searched the cabin, finding nothing of significance, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, we heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, just like before. Panic set in as we realized we had walked into a trap. We bolted from the cabin, crashing through the underbrush, trying to put as much distance between us and the footsteps as possible. The footsteps followed, relentless and unerring. We stumbled into the clearing with the ancient tree, gasping for breath and looking for any escape. Dave pointed to a large hollow at the base of the tree, and we scrambled inside, hoping to hide. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the hollow. We held our breath, hearts pounding in our chests. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then the footsteps retreated. We waited until we were sure it was safe before crawling out. The forest was still and silent, but the feeling of being watched never left us. We made our way back to the main trail, keeping a constant lookout for any signs of pursuit. When we finally reached the ranger station, we were exhausted and shaken, but grateful to be alive. We reported everything to the rangers, who promised to investigate the cabin and the area around it. Dave decided to stay in the area, determined to continue his search for answers. Lisa and I returned to Portland, hoping to finally put this nightmare behind us. Months turned into years, and though the memories faded, they never truly left. We never found out what happened to Tom, Sarah, or Dave's girlfriend, and the mystery of the footsteps in the forest remained unsolved. Olympic National Park still holds its secrets, and somewhere in its depths, something watches and waits. The metal box and the map are now tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of a camping trip that went horribly wrong. We've never been back to the park, and we probably never will. But sometimes late at night, I can still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps, and the fear comes rushing back. I've always been an avid camper, loving the feeling of being out in nature and away from the hustle and bustle of city life. My name's Alex, and a couple of years ago, I went on a camping trip with my younger brother Mark in Northern California. We chose the Shasta Trinity National Forest for our adventure, a beautiful area known for its rugged terrain and picturesque lakes. We planned our trip for early fall, hoping to catch the tail end of the warm weather. After a few hours' drive from our home in Sacramento, we arrived at the forest in the late afternoon. We parked our car near the trailhead leading to the secluded Big Bear Lake, a spot we'd chosen for its reputation as a hidden gem. The hike to the lake was about 5 miles, through dense woods and along narrow trails. We were eager to get started. The hike was tougher than we'd anticipated. The trail was overgrown in places, and we had to navigate around fallen trees and large rocks. But the scenery was breathtaking, with towering pines and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. We finally reached Big Bear Lake just before sunset, setting up our camp on a small clearing by the water. The lake was pristine, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. That first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and talked late into the night, enjoying the peace and quiet. The stars were incredibly bright, and we felt like we were the only people in the world. We turned in early, exhausted from the hike and looking forward to a day of fishing and exploring. The next morning, we woke to a beautiful, clear day. After a quick breakfast, we grabbed our fishing gear and headed to the lake. The fish were biting, and we spent most of the morning reeling in trout and enjoying the calm water. By midday, we had enough fish for a feast and decided to explore the area around the lake. As we were walking along the shore, we came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, with weathered wood and a sagging roof. Curious, we decided to take a closer look. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the inside was filled with dust and cobwebs. There were a few broken pieces of furniture and some old tools scattered around. In one corner, we found a faded, water-damaged journal. We took the journal back to our campsite, eager to see if it held any clues about the cabin's history. The writing was difficult to read, but we managed to make out some entries. It seemed the cabin had belonged to a man named John, who had lived there alone in the 1950s. His entries started off normal, talking about his daily life and the beauty of the forest. But as we read on, they took a darker turn. John wrote about strange noises at night, shadows moving in the trees, and the feeling of being watched. His final entry was a scribbled, frantic note about something coming for him, and then the journal abruptly ended. We were both a little spooked, but we chalked it up to the ramblings of a lonely man living in isolation. We spent the rest of the day exploring and enjoying the lake, trying to put the eerie journal out of our minds. That evening, as we were cooking our fish over the fire, the forest seemed to close in around us. The once comforting sounds of nature now felt oppressive, and we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We turned in early, hoping a good night's sleep would clear our heads. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside our tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the rustling grew louder and more deliberate. I nudged Mark awake, and we both listened in tense silence. The sound moved closer. circling our tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light outside, but saw nothing. The rustling stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the campsite. We lay there, hearts racing, until exhaustion eventually overtook us, and we fell back asleep. In the morning, we found our campsite undisturbed, with no signs of any intruders. We tried to laugh it off, blaming our overactive imaginations and the creepy journal for our restless night. Determined not to let it ruin our trip, we decided to hike to a nearby waterfall we'd read about. The trail was even more rugged than the one to the lake, but the promise of the waterfall kept us going. We reached it by midday, and it was well worth the effort. The waterfall was stunning, cascading down into a crystal-clear pool. We spent the afternoon swimming and relaxing, trying to forget about the previous night's scare. On our way back to the campsite, the forest seemed darker and more foreboding. The shadows grew longer, and the air felt heavier. We quickened our pace, eager to get back before nightfall. As we approached the lake, we noticed something strange. The old cabin, which we had explored the day before, now had a faint, flickering light coming from inside. We stood there, frozen in shock. There was no way anyone could have reached the cabin without us seeing them on the trail. Gathering our courage, we decided to investigate. As we approached, the light disappeared, leaving the cabin in darkness. We cautiously stepped inside, but it was empty, just as we had left it. There were no signs of anyone having been there, and the eerie feeling of being watched returned with full force. That night we sat by the fire, too uneasy to sleep. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, every rustle and crack putting us on edge. We decided to keep watch in shifts, with one of us staying awake while the other tried to rest. Around midnight, during Mark's shift, I woke up to him shaking me urgently. The flashlight revealed movement between the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but something or someone was out there watching us. We stoked the fire, hoping to keep whatever it was at bay, and huddled together trying to stay alert. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Whatever was out there didn't come any closer, but it didn't leave either. As dawn broke, the forest seemed to return to normal, the oppressive feeling lifting with the first light of day. We decided we'd had enough. We quickly packed up our camp and started the hike back to the car. As we made our way down the trail, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every now and then we would stop and listen, hearing faint rustling behind us. We quickened our pace, our anxiety growing with every step. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear in the trunk and took off, not looking back. The drive back to Sacramento was filled with a heavy silence. Both Mark and I were lost in our thoughts, replaying the events of the past few days. We couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. We arrived home and tried to settle back into our routine, but the experience had left a mark on both of us. A few days later, I received a message from one of the park rangers we had spoken to. They had investigated the cabin and found no signs of recent activity. However, they did find more of John's journals hidden under a loose floorboard. The entries detailed increasingly disturbing experiences, culminating in his belief that he was being hunted by someone or something that lived in the forest. The rangers couldn't offer any explanations, but they advised us to stay away from that area. Despite the rangers' advice, the mystery gnawed at me. I began researching the history of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, hoping to find any clues that could explain what we experienced. I found stories of other campers who had gone missing, strange sightings, and unexplained phenomena. The more I read, the more convinced I became that something was out there, lurking in the forest. One story, in particular, stood out. It was about a group of loggers in the early 1900s who had reported seeing a shadowy figure moving through the trees. They described it as being human-like, but not quite right. The sightings continued until several loggers went missing, and the camp was eventually abandoned. Local legends spoke of a forest spirit, a guardian of the woods that didn't take kindly to intruders. I shared my findings with Mark, who was initially skeptical but eventually agreed that there was something strange going on. We decided to reach out to other people who had experienced similar events. We posted our story on several outdoor and camping forums, asking if anyone else had encountered anything unusual in the Shasta Trinity area. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of people shared their own experiences of strange noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and feelings of being watched. Some had found old cabins or campsites with eerie similarities to ours. A few had even found journals or notes left behind by previous campers. It became clear that our experience was part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. One message caught my attention. It was from a woman named Emily, who claimed to have found another journal similar to John's in a different part of the forest. She had been too scared to return, but she offered to send us the journal if we wanted to see it. We agreed, hoping it would provide more insight into what was happening. When the journal arrived, it was clear that it belonged to someone who had lived in the forest more recently. The entries described similar experiences to John's: strange noises, shadowy figures, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The writer, a man named Greg, also mentioned finding John's cabin and reading his journal. Greg had become obsessed with uncovering the truth and had ventured deeper into the forest, determined to find answers. The last entry in Greg's journal was dated just a few months before we found John's cabin. It described a plan to track the shadowy figure to its source. Greg believed there was a hidden cave or shelter where it lived and was determined to find it. The entry ended abruptly, with Greg writing that he could hear footsteps outside his camp. Mark and I decided we couldn't let this go. We needed to find out what happened to Greg, and possibly to John. We planned another trip to the Shasta Trinity National Forest, this time bringing more supplies and equipment for a longer stay. We also informed the park rangers of our plans, ensuring they knew where we would be and when to expect us back. We arrived at the forest and set up camp near Big Bear Lake, the same spot as before. This time, we were more cautious, keeping a constant lookout for any signs of movement. We spent the first day retracing our steps, revisiting the old cabin and reading through John's journals again. We marked key locations on our map, planning to search the surrounding area for any signs of Greg or the cave he mentioned. The second day, we ventured deeper into the forest, following the directions in Greg's journal. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with dense underbrush and steep inclines. We pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. As we climbed higher, the forest grew quieter, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an eerie silence. Late in the afternoon, we found it, a narrow, hidden entrance to a cave, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. It matched Greg's description perfectly. We hesitated, the weight of what we were about to do sinking in. Gathering our courage, we entered the cave, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cave was damp and musty, with narrow passages that twisted and turned. As we ventured deeper, we found signs that someone had been there: discarded food wrappers, an old sleeping bag, and a makeshift fire pit. It was clear that Greg had found the cave and had been living there for some time. but there was no sign of him now. We continued exploring, and the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. Strange markings covered the walls, and the air grew colder. Suddenly we heard it, the same rustling sound we had heard outside our tent. It was closer now, echoing through the cave. Our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Fear gripped us as we realized we weren't alone. We turned to leave, but the passage behind us was blocked. A shadowy figure stood there, watching us with piercing eyes. It was human-like, but not quite right, just as the loggers had described. The figure moved closer, and we backed away, trying to find another exit. In the chaos, we got separated. I found myself alone in a narrow passage, the figure still pursuing me. Panic set in, and I stumbled, dropping my flashlight. In the darkness, I could hear the figure's footsteps drawing closer. I groped around trying to find the flashlight, but it was too late. The footsteps stopped right in front of me, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. Just as I thought it was the end, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Mark had found me, and he was holding a flare. The figure recoiled from the light, giving us a chance to escape. We ran, navigating the twisting passages until we finally burst out into the open air. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite, the morning light breaking over the horizon. We packed up and left the forest, vowing never to return. We reported our findings to the rangers, but they found no trace of the cave or the figure. The journals were taken as evidence, but they offered no concrete explanations. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that cave, but I do know that the Shasta Trinity National Forest holds dark secrets best left undisturbed. The experience left a lasting scar, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the unknown. Camping has never been the same, and the shadows of the forest now hold a new, terrifying meaning. We survived, but the memory of that figure, the feeling of its cold hand on my shoulder, will haunt me forever. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.